Okay, so our next speaker, I'm excited to have with us today. Water is obviously on our minds here in Texas, but it's making national news all the time. We're seeing headlines about the other Colorado River. There have been multiple national articles written about the situation in Arizona, where they are very reliant in parts of the state on groundwater. And the growth there has created some conflicts and some issues. They have a regulatory system that is somewhat fragmented, and in thinking about it, I really thought it would be so great to hear from someone from Arizona to get their perspective and really kind of get some lessons learned. And is there something that we could take away from that in how we approach groundwater management? And looked out and found the absolute best resource to do that, and that is our next speaker. Sarah Porter is the director at the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University. She was so kind to travel here to be with us today. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Well, I'm having a little schadenfreude. You know that, well, it's not really schadenfreude. Let me say this. Texas became a state in 1845, right? And 10 years before that, it was its own country. Arizona became a state in 1912, and before that, we were just a territory that people passed through. It's not quite right, but as far as governmental getting it together goes, that's about right. So I think some of the things that I have to say today should be understood that in the context of a state that's evolving. Texas is evolving too, but we got started later, in particular in our groundwater regulation. Appreciate very much the introduction. Just to let you know, the Kyle Center for Water Policy, my organization, is a nonpartisan think tank based at Arizona State University's Morrison Institute. We've produced a lot of the things you expect from a think tank, lots of written reports that are critical of groundwater laws and all kinds of other things. And I will specifically point you to the Arizona Water Blueprint. There's the website, you can Google it. It's a website where we've taken many agencies' ArcGIS maps and piled them all into one big interactive map with about 60 layers related to water policy and resources, among other things. So a little bit of background. Arizona has kind of diverse sources of water. We have what you see here on the slide, Colorado River water from, the other Colorado River, which we share with 6 other states and Mexico. We have water from in-state rivers. We don't have a lot of big in-state rivers, just mainly the Salt Verde system that's managed by an agency called SRP. We have reclaimed water, and then we have groundwater. And, as in some parts of Texas, groundwater has to be, if we want to manage it sustainably, we have to manage it as a non-renewing resource. We have to be very conscious of the fact that most of the groundwater that we use in the state of Arizona is fossil groundwater that infiltrated the aquifers thousands and thousands of years ago. And that's really the big groundwater challenge that Arizona faces. Replenishment doesn't happen unless we're really deliberate about it. And then not too far off from what I understand about Texas water demand, here's the breakdown of water demand in Arizona. Agriculture is about 72% of the use, and cities, for all the growth that we're experiencing in Arizona with the population growing something like, I think it's something like 6 times since the mid-50s, cities are only using about 22% of the water supply. So now to groundwater. There was a time in Arizona when Arizona was growing like crazy, partly because during 2 world wars, the United States turned to Arizona to be a major supplier of cotton, which was used to line tires, and it was used for other purposes. And that led to a huge expansion of agriculture. And then post-World War II, Arizona had a big population boom, which has really persisted with a few crises and dips. And much of that growth, both agricultural and urban, was reliant on that non-renewing fossil groundwater. And so in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of the 20th century, people came to understand that we had a big problem. We had a big groundwater overdraft problem, overdrafting about 3 million acre-feet of water per year, mostly in central Arizona, the Phoenix to Tucson area in the middle of the state. The statewide budget currently for water is about 7 million acre-feet per year. So a 3 million acre-foot overdraft of groundwater is a pretty serious overdraft when you think about the fact that almost all of that groundwater was fossil groundwater being mined out of the aquifers. And so then Arizona, I mean, people came to see that this was an existential threat to Arizona. And they conceived of developing the longest aqueduct in the United States. This was that time in the US, and moving water over 300 miles from our western border, where the Colorado River runs, to Phoenix to Tucson. And it was in that time, then Governor, later Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, did a deal with the Secretary of State at the time, Cecil Andrus, and asked Cecil Andrus to withhold funding for the Central Arizona Project until Arizona passed groundwater management. There are many reasons. I mean, the feds thought that was a really good idea, and they created this ultimatum. Lots of reasons why you would want to do that. One of the main reasons is if you're going to bring in the biggest supply of water that a region has ever seen, you need to make sure you have customers for that water to pay off the financing. And without groundwater management, there wasn't any guarantee that there would be users of that water. They wouldn't stop using the very cheap groundwater that was available. So finally, Arizona passed the Groundwater Management Act, and in 2020, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of that act. By the way, the act was regarded for its time as some of the most forward-thinking legislation. It was celebrated in national media as very forward-thinking and amazing. It was a different time. So I'm here to offer 4 reflections on 40-plus years of groundwater management in Arizona, 4 simple reflections. The first reflection is that the Groundwater Management Act would never have happened without secrecy. And the reason I'm bringing this out is perhaps there have been similar experiences in Texas. Right now, we're at another moment in time in Arizona where our governor has pulled together a group of people to work on updating and improving our groundwater laws. And she announced that there would be subcommittees very specifically tasked, and they would meet in secret. And there's been a huge outcry that they're not meeting in secret, they're non-public meetings. There's been a great deal of outcry that the subcommittee meetings are taking place in secret. And I think this is interesting when the fact of the determination to do the meeting in secrecy to develop the Groundwater Management Act was something that has really been celebrated. Here's an outtake from a journal about the groundwater, that happened to write about the Groundwater Management Act, but the journal, the Arroyo, is a wonderful annual journal published by our competitor, the University of Arizona's Water Policy Center. But one of the people who was pulled together by Bruce Babbitt, the governor, who by the way was a water lawyer, so he kind of knew what he was doing. One of the people involved in that was Stan Turley, a Yuma legislator, member of the House of Representatives, Republican. Babbitt was a Democrat. Stan Turley had been on the public-facing groundwater committees, and he wrote in his memoir, people just showed up to those public meetings that were trying to enact groundwater reform with all the same old tired rhetoric, and no progress was being made. Everyone was getting tired. Even the press was getting tired. And it was decided that there was only one way to work out a plan, and that was to get a few hired guns to go behind closed doors and work something out. So one lesson is I think in the intervening decades, there's been more and more appreciation for involving greater numbers of stakeholders, making sure that more voices are heard. And yet there is a tension between transparency and full inclusivity and the context in which people can develop sufficient trust in order to compromise on things that are as difficult as giving up what they perceive to be their water rights. That's lesson one, or reflection one. By the way, there's a wonderful documentary. It's about a 35-minute long documentary about the Arizona Groundwater Management Act. It's available on YouTube, and it's available on Amazon. It's called Groundwater to Enact a Law for the Common Good. It's actually created by a fellow of the Kyle Center for Water Policy. So reflection two, and that is that even after 42, 43 years, the vision of the Groundwater Management Act has not been realized. So what do I mean by that? I'll start out by saying that the vision of the creators of the Groundwater Management Act, which and the people who were pulled into that little secret rump group represented mining, agriculture, and cities, basically. And they assumed that as the area that was going to be managed, and that's the area that was going to get water from the future Central Arizona project, Phoenix to Tucson, they assumed that eventually almost all of that ag land would give way to urbanization. That was just built in to the Groundwater Management Act. Everything will get more sustainable because at some point, cities are going to take over that groundwater-based agriculture. And that hasn't really happened. I should have given you more, I should have had this slide up. So you can see here is a map of Arizona, and there are colorful blobs. The blue, yellow, and pink blobs are the management, these are groundwater management areas that are served by Colorado River Water, the Central Arizona project. The little green blob, Prescott, Arizona, thought it was going to get CAP water, but no one ever built the necessary diversion canal. Well, so this is what the main things that the Groundwater Management Act did. First, there is a prohibition as of 1980 on the expansion of irrigated agriculture within the blobs, which are called active management areas, or AMAs. A limitation on new wells, strict limits on who can drill a well. You have to mostly retire an old well, or there are some limited exceptions. The regulations were designed to push municipal growth to renewable water supplies. Every 10 years, each management area, active management area, has a new conservation plan with conservation requirements for every sector, stepped up, more rigorous every 10 years. And the much vaunted 100-year assured water supply requirement for new subdivisions. Any new subdivision, a division of land of 6 or more parcels, must demonstrate before it can be platted, before it can be developed, a 100-year supply of water to serve the needs of the subdivision. And each active management area has a goal. And so for the Phoenix and Tucson active management area, the goal is safe yield. What is safe yield? It's what it sounds like, a long-term balance between the annual amount of water that's withdrawn and the amount of water that's recovered. And in 1980, we set the goal of reaching safe yield way out into the future, 2025. So the question is, are we there yet? And the answer is no, we are not. In fact, a few years ago, the Department of Water Resources looked at groundwater pumping in the active management areas and concluded that the Phoenix, Prescott, and by the way, Tucson split off its own little extra active management area, so we have the Santa Cruz active management area, that basically they will never reach safe yield with current practices. And that while the Tucson active management area briefly went into safe yield, the Department of Water Resources predicted that it wouldn't stay in safe yield. Reason being that Tucson, as it grew, became more and more reliant on water from the other Colorado River, and we are facing the prospect of bigger and bigger cuts in those supplies. So we have not reached safe yield. Even if Tucson got there, Tucson's not going to stay there Why? The main reason is this. It's that agriculture continues to mine groundwater. Agriculture in the active management areas in Arizona is overdrafting around 500,000 acre-feet of groundwater per year, with those numbers going up. And so after 40-something years, this vision of urbanization overtaking agriculture and replacing a high groundwater use land use with a low groundwater or no groundwater use land use wasn't realized. And there are lots of reasons why it wasn't realized, but I think, you might enjoy this. So this is a little graphic, and hopefully you can see the color lines. The red line is from 1985 to 2020. The red line on the top is groundwater use by agriculture within the active management areas. The green line is Colorado River water use, and what you see is a big drop in groundwater use in the early 90s, and then it crept back up and it held pretty stable. It still holds very stable at somewhere over 500,000 at least acre-feet of overdraft. This is how much they're using, not overdraft. So why haven't all those farms been replaced by urbanization? I think the main reason is that developers didn't want to develop where the farms were, even though it made a lot of sense to the water planners. To the developers, it made more sense to develop in beautiful, undeveloped desert, usually nestled in those iconic mountains that you see in central Arizona, desert mountains. Many land speculators have bought farmland in central Arizona, but they've tended to something like more than half of agriculture in the AMAs is owned by a land speculator, maybe future developer, and it's leased back and it's still being farmed. Developers, in fact, resisted this big vision that Arizona water managers had of growing cities on top of farms, and in 1993 changed the Groundwater Management Act by introducing a new program called the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District. So remember I mentioned that the Groundwater Management Act contemplates that municipal growth will occur on renewable supplies. And that made a lot of sense, thinking that there was going to be this huge supply of Colorado River water coming into central Arizona, 1.6 million acre-feet of Colorado River water. And the cities that were around in the early 1970s, when all of this was being planned and cities had a chance to request entitlements to Colorado River water, they had allocations far larger than current demand. They were given allocations very substantial in order to accommodate future growth. The development community felt that there was something, I'm really hesitant to use this word, but since they use it, I will, inequitable about pushing development to cities that had renewable supplies of water when the developers weren't around or weren't able to secure surface water supplies for development out in those areas of the desert that don't have surface water supplies available. So the development community came up with a different program, and that was to allow them to develop based on groundwater under a proposed development and enroll their lands in a replenishment district run by the Central Arizona Project, with the replenishment district being responsible for recharging the groundwater that's mined for that new development. And this was initially, it was proposed as a way of enabling development for a few retirement communities in far-flung parts of Phoenix and Tucson, but developers are smart and understood very quickly that this was going to be a much easier way to develop, much cheaper way to develop than to develop within cities and have to develop the infrastructure to move surface water to new developments. So this program proved to be more popular than anyone ever anticipated, and it has led to, not only has it led to development that uses groundwater it has led to development that doesn't do what was envisioned, which is replace agriculture with cities in central Arizona. So now we have both. We still have a lot of legacy agriculture using fossil groundwater as those farmers have a right to do. They are grandfathered, I should have mentioned. The existing farming as of 1980 was grandfathered. And then we have development occurring not on those farms. The groundwater replenishment district is so popular that in the greater Phoenix area over the last few years, over the last 10 years or so, more than half of development has occurred on the groundwater replenishment district instead of in the cities that have renewable supplies of water. And in fact, by 2024, the projection is that there will be 383,000 homes in the replenishment district. That's a good-sized city when you think about it, all as part of this replenishment district. So that's my reflection too. The Groundwater Management Act had a beautiful vision. It has a beautiful vision, and the water dorks and lawyers who were the architects of the Groundwater Management Act thought that everybody would buy into their vision, but there was an important constituency that later, maybe enough time, sometime after the fervor over the Groundwater Management Act had died down and the CAP was already in place, there was basically a move to really undermine that big vision. And we're still grappling with it. That's been one of the most recent, most difficult problems that we're dealing with. Now on to reflection 3, and that is, it is easier to impose regulation, groundwater regulation, when there's a new water supply on its way. I already shared with you that Bruce Babbitt worked with the Secretary of Interior to make groundwater management a condition of Arizona's enacting the Groundwater Management Act. The story goes that after that little group, they met every Saturday, the Rump group. They met at a law office, they had donuts, they worked line by line, paragraph by paragraph to develop the Groundwater Management Act. They finally knew they had achieved this amazing piece of work, this proposed legislation. They had the leadership of both parties in the House and the Senate, and of course the governor on side, so they knew it would pass. They were walking out of their last meeting, and Governor Babbitt turned to John Kyle, a water lawyer, future member of Arizona's delegation, and said, after this, we'll have to do something about the rural areas. And John Kyle said, yes, but not today. And that was sometime in June of 1980, and we still haven't done something about the rural areas. The rural areas in Arizona, for the most part, declined to be part of groundwater management, probably largely because they weren't getting a big new supply of water. There was no carrot out there to entice them, and also because of the resistance that is very strong in rural Arizona. Perhaps, I haven't heard much about it yet, but there's very strong resistance in rural Arizona to metering wells or to most forms of groundwater regulation. But the fact is that now many rural areas of Arizona are quite vulnerable. There have been many national news stories we've seen as, I think regulation is occurring in California, for example, or in other places in the world, as aquifers are tapped completely dry. Industrial scale agriculture is moving into rural Arizona to start pistachio and pecan farms, to start alfalfa operations, much of that alfalfa to be exported. The absence of regulations in rural parts of Arizona is effectively a magnet for heavy groundwater use. And we have many communities that are extremely vulnerable. To date, the state legislature has declined to take action to protect these areas, and to some degree, people living in the very vulnerable areas are sending people to the legislature who are opting not to protect them. So there may be some degree of will in here. But the long and the short of it is that the majority of rural areas are vulnerable to groundwater supply deficit in the next century or so. So that's third reflection. It would be so much easier if someone would just bring in a big supply of water and then we could fix the rural areas. And finally, the press isn't helping us at all. We're at a point in Arizona where how many of you have seen any of the articles, for example, about the Saudi dairy? Yeah, I see a lot of hands. I mean, we're getting a lot of press about the lack of groundwater regulations in rural areas. Just in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of press about new limitations on development in the Phoenix area. I'm seeing nods. You all have seen those stories. And the press loves these stories because they're clickbait. So here's what's really happened in Arizona in the last 4 years. In 2019, the state limited groundwater-dependent development in the Pinal Active Management Area, which is the one between Phoenix and Tucson. The state models groundwater use out to the next 100 years. They model current and committed demand to the next 100 years. And concluding that all of that water was allocated, the state limited new subdivisions in the Pinal AMA. In 2022, Arizona created a new active management area down in the southeastern corner of the state, and then a new area called an irrigation non-expansion area. We have 3 of these in Arizona. These are places there's a lower degree of groundwater regulation, but mainly new irrigated agriculture is prohibited. So the state added an AMA and an INA to the regulated areas in 2022. And then in 2023, in June, Arizona imposed limitations on groundwater-dependent development in the Phoenix area. I mean, doesn't it seem like we're trying? We're trying to manage groundwater. Something like 85% of people in Arizona live between Phoenix and from Phoenix to Tucson, the Phoenix to Tucson area. So doesn't that sound like a state that's trying to manage effectively, modeling out 100 years, and then saying today, in 100 years, we'll have a supply deficit, no more development on groundwater, go find a renewable supply? Well, these are the well, let's keep going. These are the let's go past that. These are the headlines we get. Arizona limits construction around Phoenix as its water supply dwindles. Our water supply isn't dwindling. We're just making sure that the people who have had it allocated get to use it. The lead line there, in what could be a glimpse of the future as climate change batters the West, officials ruled there's not enough groundwater for projects already approved. Well, that's not only inaccurate, climate change had very little to do with this. This is about a groundwater model. The Washington Post, a new report amounts to a chilling warning for a region that has been a development hotspot for new residents and high-tech businesses. What's chilling about a department doing a 100-year forward-looking groundwater model and concluding that the groundwater is fully allocated and that it's time to develop alternative supplies of water or reallocate groundwater supplies in order for additional development? This isn't helpful to the state, and in my experience, it drastically changes the way the conversation should be happening in Arizona and is driving it to become more partisan and really frightening people who are involved in land development in a way that it shouldn't. And then finally, you all saw the groundwater model today, maybe, in the New York Times. I opened up the groundwater article today and thought, wow, the New York Times isn't beating up on Phoenix. This is so refreshing. And then I got down into the article, and there was a paragraph that says, around Phoenix, one of America's fastest growing cities, the crisis is severe enough that the state has said there's not enough groundwater in parts of the county to build new houses that rely on aquifers. Arizona's determination not to allow new subdivisions based on groundwater is not a crisis. It is the regulations that were put in place in 1980 simply taking effect as they were known to do. Had I more time, I could talk with you for another half an hour about how the development community had a great advance warning that this was going to happen. They've known since 2007, but for some reason didn't get on it. So finally, I'll close with this. I feel like I've given you kind of the bad news about the Groundwater Management Act. I do think to some degree it's working. We're still in overdraft. We have more work to do. And I feel optimistic. Maybe I'm Uncle Stan here. As you know, cities are smart. Texas knows this. Cities have a lot of tools, the ability to be creative, and most important, money. And so cities will be able to make sure, the cities of Phoenix and Tucson will be able to make sure of sufficient water supply in order to allow us to continue to thrive and enjoy our quality of life. Thank you.
We do have time for just a couple questions. I did have one come in on the app that I was going to read for you. Could you speak to the replenishment activities that are tasked to each of the management areas?
Yeah, so replenishment is required for new subdivisions, almost entirely residential subdivisions. And so they actually, we are recharging aquifers. I'm not sure if the question is related to how does it happen hydrologically, and it basically, most of it happens either by aquifer recharge occurring near the Central Arizona Project Canal, so water's being moved to Central Arizona and then put in the aquifers. Also, effluent, a significant amount of effluent is being put in aquifers. And the other way it happens is that cities with extra Colorado River water can send their water to a groundwater using agricultural irrigation district, allowing that district to use Colorado River water instead of groundwater, and then cities can accrue recharge credits. The Groundwater Management Act imposes kind of a cap and trade system for cities on groundwater, not necessarily cities and industry. And so cities, by recharging aquifers, can accrue credits, groundwater storage credits. And there's a very vibrant market for those credits.
And one other had come in Texas, groundwater is private property. What is its status in Arizona?
So fortunately, Arizona's Supreme Court determined right after the Groundwater Management Act was passed that while there's a usufruct right, a right to use groundwater, it is not a property right, and that would be in Chino Valley versus City of Prescott. So that helps Arizona. It's easier for our, I think it's arguably easier for our legislature to do things about groundwater. It's just harder for them to do it politically.
Anyone else in the audience want to ask a question before we thank the speaker? Wonderful. Let's give Sarah a round of applause. Yeah, absolutely.
My friend Jeremy at Roscoe Moss has kindly agreed to have a pile of our report on the new Phoenix AMA groundwater model on his table as a fellow Phoenician, being friendly. So if you're interested in a deep dive into groundwater law in Arizona, just right out there to the right.
Yes, they're one of our exhibitors in the hallway. Let's thank Sarah for being here. Appreciate you coming, joining us.